in the quiet cradle of Tuscany, where the light rests gently upon the river Arno, and the hills curve like the folded arms of an old friend, Florence begins its slow breath. The city is not yet the Florence you imagine, no dazzling frescoes splashed across chapel ceilings, no golden age of poets or philosophers, no marble palaces climbing toward the sun. It is still young, still cautious, still wrapped in the simple fabric of everyday life, and in that soft world of merchants and workshops, where morning bells drift across cobblestone paths, you can almost feel history warming its hands before a fire it has not yet lit. Imagine standing at the riverbank before sunrise. The water glides like a long ribbon of silver beneath a sky still hesitant to wake. The villagers move about quietly, murmuring to one another as they carry baskets of wool, rolls of cloth, and sacks of grain. Their steps are slow, their breaths gentle, their minds balancing daily worries with small hopes. No one here knows that their city will one day be called the birthplace of genius. No one imagines that from among these simple households will rise a family whose name will echo through palaces, churches, courts, and kingdoms. A family who will shape destiny not with swords, but with coins, ideas, and the art of understanding people, yet even now, before their story truly begins. The Medici name floats through the market era, small, almost fragile whisper. A whisper of trade, a whisper of trust, a whisper of a family that begins not with kings or warriors, but with healers. For the word Medici itself means the doctors, and though the family's earliest origins remain blurred by time, legend holds that they began as simple folk skilled in mending wounds, calming fevers, and offering remedies crafted from herbs gathered in the Tuscan hills. The people sought them for relief, and from that trust grew a reputation strong enough to shape the first threads of their identity. As Florence stirs awake, you can feel the rhythm of life winding itself through narrow streets lined with stone homes. Children shuffle sleepily beside their parents, and the scent of baking bread drifts from small ovens tucked behind heavy wooden doors. A blacksmith hammers gently as if not to disturb the dawn, shaping horseshoes with sparks that rise like fireflies. A merchant sets out bolts of fabric dyed the color of sunset clay. The city is quiet but alive, humming softly like a lullaby carried by the morning wind. But if you listen with a different kind of errant ear tuned to the heartbeat of history, you might sense a shift beneath these simple sounds. Because Florence is not just a city of workers. It is a city of competition, ambition, and dreams. Every trade carries weight. Every handshake is a promise. Every coin exchanged is a seed planted for tomorrow's fortunes. And in this delicate dance of survival and progress, the Medici family begins to find their place, not as healers of the body, but as healers of financial need. In these early centuries, the world is unpredictable. Kingdoms rise and fall with the turn of a season. A poor harvest can unmake a community. A merchant's success can be undone by a sudden storm at sea. And yet, those who understand the movement of money, how to protect it, how to grow it, how to help others use it wisely, hold quiet power. Power not declared, not shouted, not carved into stone, but woven silently into the daily lives of others. That is where the Medici story truly begins. Not with fortune, but with trust. Not with control, but with service. They loan when others cannot. They forgive debts when doing so wins loyalty. They invest in merchants whose dreams outweigh their resources. And as Florence expands, so does the Medici presence. Moving quietly along the river's pulse, like a small boat drifting toward broader waters. As decades pass, Florence becomes a tapestry of color and energy. The wool trade grows strong. Banking becomes an art of calculation and courage. Markets stretch wider. Workshops glow with new skill. And the Medicis, still modest compared to the noble families who tower above them, continue to build their foundation coin by coin, handshake by handshake. You can imagine them walking these streets, not yet recognized, yet walking with a sense of purpose that feels almost prophetic. But this chapter is not about power or wealth. It is about the atmosphere before the storm of influence ignites. It is the hush before the orchestra begins. It is the soft, rich soil from which the Medici legacy will later rise like a mighty cedar. The hills around Florence stand watch, like ancient guardians. The river reflects the shifting colors of the dawn. And somewhere among the narrow homes of the San Lorenzo district, the Medici family gathers for another day, unaware of the centuries that will one day speak their name with reverence. Picture this moment as a quiet room lit by a single candle. If you lean closer, you might hear the soft murmur of Claudia, an early Medici mother instructing her children on the importance of honesty, or the slow, thoughtful footsteps of Averardo, an ancestor whose simple choices will later shape the destiny of millions. Their names may be small now, their stories not yet written, but the feeling surrounding them is unmistakable. Something is awakening, something gentle, something destined. Florence during this time is a city of contrasts. It is both humble and hopeful. It is vibrant with possibility, yet weary from the burdens of medieval uncertainty. The plague has passed through Europe more than once, leaving fear etched into the memory of every household. The economy rises and falls like the tide. Factions argue over control. But still, the city holds on to a strange kind of optimism, a belief that beauty, knowledge, and order can be found even in chaos. And that belief creates the perfect environment for the Medici to flourish. When you imagine the early Medici walking through their neighborhood, imagine the calm strength in their posture. They know the value of patience. They understand the flow of effort over time. They see opportunity in relationships, not in domination. And as they listen to the whispers of Florence, they learn that success does not come from loud ambition, but from steady presence, from reliability, from gentleness in a world often ruled by force. The Arno glistens as if holding secrets beneath its surface. Birds circle above terracotta rooftops. The bells of the Basilica di San Lorenzo ring softly through morning mist. And across countless days like this, the Medici begin weaving their invisible thread through the city's heart. It is a slow thread, delicate but strong, stretching from family to neighbor, from neighbor to trade partner, from trade partner to guild leader, until one day the thread will extend across Europe itself, tying together emperors, popes, artists, thinkers, and the very soul of the Renaissance. But that comes later. Much later. For now, Florence remains in its early bloom, and the Medici remain a family of steady hands, warm smiles, and thoughtful decisions. Their home is filled with the faint fragrance of rosemary hung to dry. Their conversations revolve around children's futures, the ethics of lending, the importance of fairness. Their evenings end with oil lamps flickering against old stone walls as stories pass from one generation to the next. If you let yourself breathe slowly, you might feel the kind of peace that wrapped around their world. A peace that arrives only in the beginning of things, before ambition grows, before politics collide, before great destinies unfold. This is the peace of potential. the quiet hum of something extraordinary waiting patiently for its moment to enter the world. As night settles gently over Florence, listen to the hush of the river once more. Hear the soft footsteps of a Medici ancestor heading home under a sky brushed with stars. See the faint glow of candles behind shuttered windows. Feel the promise of a future that neither they nor you can see yet, but can somehow sense in the rhythm of the air. And as you drift into this quiet world, warm, simple, full of promise, let yourself rest in the understanding that every great story begins like this, with whispers, with stillness, with the soft movements of ordinary lives about to become extraordinary. The Medici legacy may grow vast and powerful, but its roots are humble, grounded, and deeply human. And in this gentle moment by the Arno's edge, history waits, calm and patient, ready to unfold. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. Florence in the early dawn feels like a world caught between two heartbeats. A city hovering gently between what it has been and what it is slowly becoming. By the time the Medici family begins to take its first true steps into the currents of influence, the world around them is already stirring in ways that hint at deeper transformations. The marketplace grows louder. Streets once quiet now echo with the sounds of ambition, and woven through these rising energies is a soft thread of curiosity, beauty, and restless imagination, an awakening that soon comes to be known as the Renaissance. But in its earliest form, it is only a spark, flickering quietly in the minds of a few and in the actions of families like the Medici. Imagine Florence now as a tapestry not yet colored, its threads stretched and waiting. The city is governed by guilds, each holding authority over different trades and professions. Bakers, wool merchants, stone carvers, silk workers. Money changes each guild shapes the rhythm of daily life. Yet the guilds themselves are in a constant dance of alliance and rivalry. Wealth determines influence, influence determines policy, and policy shapes opportunity. It is a fragile balance, one that demands both strength and subtlety. Into this world steps the Medici family, not yet the towering figures history remembers, but thoughtful observers, careful learners, and patient dreamers. This chapter is about the moment when possibility becomes intention, when a family realizes not only what Florence is, but what Florence could be, when the Medici see pathways opening before them, pathways that connect trade to power, banking to diplomacy, generosity to loyalty, and dreams to destiny. At the center of these early sparks stands one name, Giovanni de Medici. He is not the first Medici of historical record, but he is the first whose presence carries the gravitational pull of transformation. Giovanni is a man of quiet strength. He speaks little, but listens deeply. He watches the world with the calm attentiveness of someone who has learned to survive uncertainty. He understands that success is rarely loud. Instead, it is found in stillness, in waiting for the right moment, in building trust long before calling upon it. Giovanni begins his career not as a noble, but as a banker, a profession once considered modest, even suspect, but slowly gaining recognition as the arteries that carry a city's lifeblood. Banking is delicate work. It requires precision, honesty, insight, and a strong sense of responsibility. A banker must understand not only numbers, but people, their fears, their hopes, their patterns, their needs. Giovanni excels at this. He learns how markets rise and fall. He learns how merchants succeed or falter. He learns how war, famine, and politics shape the value of every coin. But more importantly, He learns how to see opportunity where others see risk. As Florence's economy grows, Giovanni opens the door to a new kind of Medici identity, one shaped by financial wisdom and human connection. He establishes relationships with merchants who travel far beyond Tuscany, reaching toward France, England, Flanders, and the Mediterranean ports. He funds ventures others find too uncertain. He supports craftsmen whose dreams exceed their resources. And little by little, he builds something that will become the heart of Medici: influence, trust. The Medici Bank grows slowly, like a tree spreading its roots before reaching toward the sun. Giovanni avoids ostentation. He avoids the spotlight. His success is measured in stability, not spectacle. His home remains simple, his clothes unremarkable, his demeanor humble. But beneath that humility lies a visionary mind. He sees Florence heading toward a future where power will not be earned by swords but by ideas, innovation, and cooperation. He senses that the world is ready to awaken from the long sleep of the Middle Ages, and he knows Florence vibrant, curious. Restless Florence is the perfect cradle for that awakening. Picture Giovanni walking through the narrow streets near the Medici home. The bells of the nearby churches echo softly as he greets neighbors with warmth and familiarity. He carries no air of superiority, only a quiet resolve. He sees the city's artisans carving new designs into marble. He sees young scholars gathering in small groups to discuss ancient texts recently rediscovered. He sees merchants displaying goods from lands many Florentines have never heard of. The world is expanding, and he intends to help Florence expand with it. But even with these sparks of possibility, Florence is never simple. The city's political environment is turbulent, shaped by rival families like the Albizzi and the Strozzi, who guard their power fiercely. The Albizzi in particular see themselves as natural stewards of Florentine authority. They view rising families, especially those who gain influence through trade, rather than noble birth, with wary eyes. Giovanni, however, knows that confronting powerful families directly would be perilous. Instead, he practices what will later become a Medici signature: the art of quiet influence. He supports communities during difficult winters. He funds repairs for local churches. He lends money without harsh terms. He intervenes in disputes with a calm, steady presence. People begin to view the Medici as more than bankers. They see them as protectors, supporters, allies, people who understand the city's needs. It is in these actions that the deeper Medici identity forms. Their wealth is not for distance or grandeur. It is for connection. It is for building bridges. It is for guiding the city toward a future shaped by compassion, innovation, and shared prosperity. At night, when Florence falls into a soft stillness, you can imagine Giovanni sitting beside a lantern, reviewing ledgers not only with a banker's precision, but with a philosopher's curiosity. His thoughts are not consumed by numbers alone. They drift into reflections about the meaning of wealth, the purpose of influence, and the responsibilities that come with both. He wonders how a family might uplift a city rather than control it. And in these quiet reflections, the Medici dream begins to take shape, the dream of supporting artists, scholars, architects, and thinkers who will one day redefine human expression. The early Renaissance itself resembles a flicker of candlelight during these nights. Scholars translate forgotten Greek manuscripts. Artists experiment with perspective and light. Builders imagine structures that reach upward with both beauty and intention. Florence is becoming a garden where creativity grows freely. watered by curiosity and warmed by the desire for meaning. And the Medici, without fully realizing it yet, are becoming gardeners themselves. By the time Giovanni's influence spreads through Florence, the Medici name carries a new weight. It suggests reliability. It brings comfort. It inspires confidence. And for a family whose legacy will one day shape countenance, this is where everything begins, not with grandeur, not with royal titles, but with the simple, enduring power of being trusted. Yet even as Giovanni guides the Medici into prominence, he remains aware of the delicate balance around him. He knows that the Albizzi look upon his influence with suspicion. He knows competition simmers beneath Florence's vibrant surface. He knows too much power can be dangerous. But he also knows that the only way to shape the future is to understand the present hand. That understanding requires patience, humility, and heart. As you imagine Giovanni closing his ledger for the night, listen to the quiet around him. Hear the distant flow of the Arno, steady and unhurried. Feel the cool breath of the Tuscan evening drifting through a cracked window. Sense the gentle warmth of a small flame illuminating the wooden table before him. These moments, simple and still, are where many Medici decisions are born. They come not from pressure or impulse, but from reflection. Outside, Florence sleeps. Inside, a dream grows. And so, with each thoughtful choice, Giovanni shapes the first sparks of a legacy that will illuminate the Renaissance. A legacy carried not only through political power or grand architecture, but through the belief that supporting human potentials, supporting beauty, curiosity, and expression is one of the most meaningful contributions a family can make. This is the quiet dawn before the Medici become giants, the spark before the flame, the first breath of a dream that will lift Florence into a golden age. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. The story of the Medici enters a new rhythm with the birth of a child, who will one day be known as the quiet architect of Florence's destiny. His name is Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici, but history will call him Cosimo, the elder, potter, patriarch, father of the fatherland. Yet in the beginning, before titles and triumphs, before alliances and exiles, he is simply a boy growing up in a city learning to breathe the early air of the Renaissance. And like all great stories, his begins softly. Beneath the warm stretch of the Tuscan sun taught to picture Cosimo's early world. Imagine Florence in the late 1300s, still a city of stone and spirit, where narrow streets wind like curious thoughts and rooftops glow red beneath the afternoon light. The Arno flows gently, carrying reflections of the sky in waters that have watched centuries unfold. Workshops bustle with the sound of chisels, looms, and hammers. Traders shout prices over crates of wool and barrels of spice. Priests carry lanterns through dusky alleys. And above it all, the slow, contemplative hum of a city searching for beauty. Truth and meaning grow stronger each day. Cosimo absorbs this world the way a seed absorbs rain. His father, Giovanni, teaches him not just how to count coins or assess risks, but how to understand people. Giovanni believes that banking, at its heart, is not a profession of numbers, it is a profession of trust. And so, from a young age, Cosimo learns to read the subtle expressions of merchants as they negotiate deals. He watches his father welcome travelers from distant cities. He listens as artisans describe the dreams behind their work. In these moments, a foundation forms beneath him, steady as marble. But Cosimo is not merely a child of banking. He is a child of Florence itself, city alive with conversation, philosophy, and imagination. He grows up walking streets where Dante once wandered, hearing stories of ancient Rome, and listening to the poetry of early humanists who whisper that knowledge is not something inherited but something discovered. This idea lights something inside him, a flame not yet visible to others but destined to illuminate generations. He observes everything, the way shadows fall across cathedral walls, the way merchants argue passionately about wool prices, the way scholars gather in corners of small libraries to debate lines from Aristotle or Cicero. Florence is a classroom, a stage, a living book, and Cosimo reads it all. During these years, the Medici home is warm but modest. Giovanni believes wealth should be used wisely, not displayed extravagantly. Their meals are simple, their clothing practical, their gatherings full of quiet conversation rather than boisterous celebration. In this gentle environment, Cosimo grows thoughtful, observant, and deeply introspective. Where other boys chase excitement, he chases understanding as he matures. Giovanni introduces him to the family business in earnest. Cosimo learns how letters of credit travel across continents like silent messengers. He learns how to assess currency exchange rates without letting emotion cloud judgment. He learns why some ventures succeed despite risk and why others fail despite promise. More importantly, he learns that the true measure of influence lies not in how loudly one speaks, but in how deeply one listens. This combination discipline and curiosity, humility and vision begins shaping Cosimo into something Florence has not yet seen. A leader who does not crave power but naturally attracts it, yet the world around him is not calm. Florence is a city with a heartbeat too strong to remain steady. Rivalries swirl like wind through open piazzas. Families battle for dominance. Alliances fracture, and political factions clash beneath the facade of civic order. The Medici family, proud and established, looks upon rising merchant families with suspicion. They see Giovanni's success and Cosimo's promise not as a natural shift in the city's direction, but as a threat. Still, Cosimo remains steady. He does not rush. He does not provoke. He moves through the world with the quiet certainty of someone who understands that time works in favor of those who honor it. He builds relationships with priests, merchants, artists, scholars, and guild leaders. He lends money to those overlooked by the banks controlled by noble families. He speaks gently, but with substance. And slowly, the Medici begin to expand from being simply bankers of Florence to the backbone of Florence. The spark becomes a warm glow. This period of Cosimo's life is filled with lessons, the kind that unfolds slowly, like petals opening at sunset. One lesson comes from watching his father navigate crises with grace. Another emerges from observing how a small act of generosity can create loyalty that lasts decades. But perhaps the most meaningful insight Cosimo gathers is this: wealth can build walls, or it can build bridges. And bridges, once built, can carry a city into a new age. Cosimo feels this truth somewhere deep inside his chest, even before he knows what he will do with it. One of the places that shapes him most is the San Marco quarter of Florence. Known for its religious quietness and scholarly activity, Cosimo is drawn to monasteries and libraries like others are drawn to festivals. He walks through halls where monks copy ancient texts by candlelight. He listens to the soft turning of parchment pages. He breathes in the scent of ink and old paper. Here, surrounded by the knowledge of centuries, something settles gently inside him. the understanding that ideas more than gold, more than armies are, the true treasures of civilization. And so he begins collecting manuscripts, supporting scholars, and encouraging the study of classical philosophy. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, as if nurturing a fragile flame. He does not yet know that this flame will one day illuminate all of Florence, or that his patronage will help spark the cultural movement we now call the Renaissance. Around him, the world grows turbulent once more. Europe wrestles with conflict. Trade routes shift. Plagues return in waves that leave entire neighborhoods silent. Florence, too, stumbles under the weight of uncertainty. And yet, through all of this, Cosimo remains a steady presence, calm as the Arno at dusk, patient as the hills that cradle the city. By the time Giovanni's health begins to fade, Cosimo stands ready, not because he seeks to replace his father, but because he has quietly prepared himself for years. Giovanni sees in him not only a capable banker, but a visionary leader. He entrusts him with the Medici Bank, with the family, with relationships built over decades of sincerity. And when Giovanni dies, Florence feels the shift. The gentle torch is passed. Cosimo steps into the world, not with grand announcements, but with soft certainty. His leadership style reflects everything he learned through years of observation: humility, intelligence, generosity, caution, and deep emotional insight. He knows the Albizzi still watch him. He knows politics is a river full of hidden currents. But he also knows the power of goodwill, of strategy guided by empathy, of influence built not through fear but through trust. Under Cosimo, the Medici Bank expands like a tree opening its branches toward distant skies. Branches appear in Rome, Venice, Geneva, London, and Bruges. Each branch strengthens the Medici presence in European finance. Each partnership deepens their network of influence. And with each new success, Cosimo grows, not arrogant, but more thoughtful. He uses the bank not only to earn wealth, but to support those who carry the future of Florence, artists with untested ideas, architects with bold visions, scholars with fragile manuscripts needing preservation. Already, the essence of the Renaissance begins to shimmer. Faintly but unmistakably. Yet Cosimo's rise is not without challenge. The Albizzi family grows tense as Medici popularity spreads. Florence's factional politics sharpen like blades. And Cosimo must navigate not only markets, but egos, rivalries, and power maneuvers. Still, he remains grounded. His demeanor never shifts from calm. His generosity never disappears. His belief in the potential of Florence never dims. He understands something profound. Influence is not taken, it is given. Freely, by the hearts of people who feel they are understood, supported, and valued. There is a moment, often imagined by historians, though not recorded in any book, a moment when Cosimo stands at the edge of the Arno, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The river glows gold, the surface barely rippling. Lanterns flicker behind him as evening settles across the city. In this quiet, it is easy to imagine what he feels. That Florence is not just a home, but a promise. A promise of what human beings can create when their souls are nurtured, when their minds are fed, when their dreams are taken seriously. He is not yet the most powerful man in Florence, but he is becoming the most trusted, and trust, as he learned from Giovanni, is the true foundation of any lasting legacy. This chapter of Cosimo's life, the early chapter, is not defined by dramatic battles or grand achievements. It is defined by growth, observation, and intention. It is the chapter where a young man becomes a visionary, where ambition becomes purpose, where the quiet rise of a single individual begins to echo softly across a city ready for rebirth. Cosimo does not yet know how far his influence will reach. He cannot imagine the towering cathedral domes he will help fund, the artists whose names will one day define beauty itself, or the generations who will look back on his choices with awe. But he feels, deep within him, that he is meant not just to benefit from Florence, but to shape it, and so, beneath the Tuscan sun, his gentle rise continues steady, warm, patient like dawn unfolding across a sleeping world. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There comes a moment in every great story when quiet foundations transform into something larger, something invisible yet unmistakable, something woven so gently into the fabric of a city that people feel its presence long before they recognize its source. For Florence, this moment arrives when Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici begins to understand not only the weight of influence, but the delicate architecture behind it. Not a fortress built of stone, not a palace built of marble, but a structure made of relationships, trust, diplomacy, generosity, and timing. A structure he builds not with force, but with grace, patiently, steadily, with a softness that hides strength beneath serenity. Imagine Florence in the years after Cosimo steps into his father's place. The city seems to breathe differently, mark its pulse with renewed activity. Scholars speak with greater confidence. Artists feel encouraged to experiment with forms and colors never attempted before. It is subtle at first, like a shift in the wind or the faint change of light from one season to the next. But those who pay attention, those who move through the heart of Florence every day, feel the difference. They feel a warmth beginning to rise, a sense of possibility floating above the cobblestones, like morning mist. Cosimo, now guiding the Medici Bank through the complexities of international finance, moves with the calm assurance of someone who sees years ahead. His influence grows not through sudden gestures, but through patterns of kindness, patterns of opportunity, patterns of thoughtful support. He funds small workshops struggling to purchase raw wool. He steps in quietly when a church roof needs repair. He lends to guild members whose businesses stumble under unexpected burdens. And gradually, the people of Florence begin to associate his name with stability and comfort. It is here, in these tender gestures, that he begins shaping the quiet architecture of power. For Cosimo understands something critical. Asterisk power built loudly crumbles quickly, but power built quietly lasts for generations. Asterisk power built on fear breeds resentment, but power built on generosity becomes rooted in gratitude. And most importantly, power enacted through kindness spreads in ripples that return to the source long after the initial wave has softened. Still, Florence is not a forgiving place. Political tension mounts as rival families watch the Medici rise. The Albizzi, long accustomed to controlling civic decisions, grow increasingly uneasy. They do not understand Cosimo's influence because it does not resemble the power they know. It does not shout. It whispers. It does not threaten. It comforts. It does not overwhelm. It welcomes. This difference unsettles them. For quiet power is far more difficult to confront than visible authority. In private meetings, members of the Albizzi family express concern. They accuse the Medici of becoming too loved, a phrase that sounds strange to modern ears. but carried deep meaning in a world where affection could translate into political strength. Being loved meant being trusted, and being trusted meant people would turn toward you during uncertainty. In Florence, uncertainty was constant. Cosimo, however, remains composed. He senses the Albizzi's discomfort, but he does not challenge them openly. Instead, he focuses on building the kind of influence no decree can erase: human connection. He invests in relationships the way an artist invests in canvas and pigment, with careful attention to detail and an understanding that beauty often emerges slowly. One of his greatest sources of quiet influence comes from his patronage. Cosimo recognizes beauty as a form of currency. He understands that artists, sculptors, architects, and philosophers are not simply creators of decoration. They are shapers of identity. Florence's spirit is carved in marble and written in ink. Its soul is painted in frescoes and sung in hymns. If he supports the creators of this beauty, he supports the very heart of the city, and so he does. He funds workshops where young artists experiment with perspective, depth, and light techniques still new to the world. He supports architects dreaming of designs that stretch upward like yearning hands. He sponsors scholars collecting fragments of ancient wisdom scattered through monasteries and ruins. His home becomes a place where geniuses gather not to serve politics, but to nurture thought. In these quiet gatherings, Florence edges closer to becoming the cradle of the Renaissance. But Cosimo's architecture of power is not built solely on beauty. It is built on structure, financial, political, and emotional. He learns to balance these elements with the intuition of a musician tuning strings. The Medici Bank becomes a network across Europe, connecting Florence to courts and kingdoms through credit lines and partnerships. The bank serves as both protector and benefactor. Monarchs seek Medici loans. Popes turn to Medici expertise. Merchants rely on Medici stability. Suddenly, Florence's fortunes do not move without touching the Medici hand. Yet Cosimo himself does not appear grand or boastful. He still walks through Florence with humility. He greets neighbors as equals. He dresses modestly, speaks gently, and avoids confrontational debates. His presence is soft, so soft that some mistake it for passivity. But softness, in Cosimo's hands, becomes strategy. He proves that influence does not require noise. It requires consistency. Still, political storms gather. Florence is a city divided between factions, the popolani, the merchants and common citizens who yearn for opportunity, and the grandi, the noble families who believe leadership comes from heritage rather than merit. The Albizzi represent the latter, and they worry that Cosimo's popularity among the popolani threatens the balance of power. Their fears harden into action. Yet before this confrontation arrives before exile, before return, before triumph and rebuilding, Cosimo continues crafting the internal blueprint of his leadership. He embraces a philosophy that becomes the foundation of his life. Asterisk, asterisk, serve the city, and the city will serve you. Asterisk, asterisk, support others, and they will support you. Treat every problem with patience, and time itself will become an ally. He learns to navigate Florence's political councils with care, speaking only when necessary, always choosing words that pacify rather than provoke. His diplomacy becomes famous, not for eloquence, but for restraint. He understands that silence can be louder than speech, that stillness can be stronger than momentum. This period of Cosimo's life is filled with the kind of growth that happens in shadows, in corridors, in whispered conversations, in decisions made late at night while reviewing ledgers by candlelight. And if you imagine him in these late hours, alone in a quiet room, quill in hand, eyes thought for you, might understand the depth of the man he is becoming. He is not building power. He is cultivating stability. He is not seeking authority. He is seeking harmony. He is not yearning for recognition. He is nurturing Florence itself. These intentions become visible across the city. Streets are repaired. Workshops flourish. Young thinkers feel newly inspired. Cosimo's actions wrap Florence in a gentle sense of security, as soft assurance that someone is watching, someone is guiding, someone is investing in the city's soul. But beneath this warmth lies tension. Rival families whisper that Cosimo's influence is dangerous. They claim he manipulates guilds through financial ties. They accuse him of buying loyalty with loans. They fear he is creating a parallel government, one made not of laws, but of affection. They are not entirely wrong, but they misunderstand something fundamental. Cosimo does not want to rule Florence. He wants to uplift it. This difference will shape the next decades of history, for now. Though Cosimo continues constructing his silent architecture, unaware that its strength will soon be tested in ways that shake every corner of the city. He will face exile, betrayal, uncertainty. He will learn what it means to lose everything, and he will discover, beyond all expectation, that his quiet network of trust is far stronger than the loud power of the Albizzi. But those chapters are still ahead in this moment. Cosimo stands in the soft glow of Florence's dawn, gazing at a city he loves deeply, quietly, wholeheartedly. The hills surrounding Florence curve gently, as if holding the city in their arms. The Arno reflects the sunlight like a pathway toward tomorrow. And Cosimo, breathing in the morning air, senses that Florence is ready for a rebirth, one built not by force, but by wisdom. He does not know yet that he will become the most powerful man in Florence. He does not know yet that his investments will ignite the Renaissance, or that his family name will become synonymous with brilliance and innovation. He simply moves forward, step by step, guided by humility and vision, shaping a structure no storm will easily break in the quiet architecture of power. Cosimo finds his destiny, and Florence finds its future. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. Some stories in history do not merely unfold, they bloom, slowly and brilliantly, like a flower pushing open its petals to the sunlight. Lorenzo de' Medici's story is one of these, where Cosimo built the roots of the family's influence with patience and humility. Lorenzo becomes the blossom that bursts open under the Tuscan sky, filling Florence with color, fragrance, and a vitality that transforms the city forever. His life is not just a sequence of political moments. It is a work of art, one woven with poetry, music, diplomacy, laughter, crisis, and a generosity of spirit that few leaders in history have ever matched. Imagine Florence as Lorenzo inherits it. The city is already rising, shaped by Cosimo's careful architecture of trust, strengthened by the Medici Bank, and warmed by a growing appreciation for beauty, scholarship, and innovation. But still, Florence waits for something more, something bold, something radiant. It waits for a voice that will speak not just to its mind, but to its heart. It waits for someone who will not simply guide the city, but inspire it. That person, history tells us, is the young Lorenzo, born in 1449. Lorenzo grows up surrounded by the very best minds Florence can gather. As a child, he sits beside philosophers who discuss the nature of virtue, poets who recite verses older than the walls around them, and painters whose eyes sparkle with visions of worlds they long to create. His home is a sanctuary for creativity. His education is not limited to arithmetic and politics, but filled with music, poetry, philosophy, and the subtle language of human relationships. Lorenzo's mother, Lucretia Tornabuoni, plays a profound role in shaping him. She is intelligent, compassionate, and deeply spiritual, a woman whose wisdom softens the sharp edges of political life. From her, Lorenzo learns the importance of empathy, diplomacy, and understanding. From Cosimo's example, he learns the quiet power of listening and the value of restraint. Yet from the city of Florence itself, the bells, the waterways, the marketplaces, the artist learns something else: the joy of expression, the desire to live vividly, the sense that beauty is not luxury, but nourishment. By the time Lorenzo reaches his early 20s, Florence sees in him something rare, a leader whose charisma is gentle, whose laughter comes easily, and whose presence feels like sunlight breaking through clouds. The people call him Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, not because of grandeur or wealth, but because he embodies the spirit of Florence in its brightest form. He walks the streets without guards, greeting merchants and apprentices with warmth. He sponsors festivals that turn the piazzas into oceans of music, dance, and color. He reads poetry aloud as though reciting sacred scripture. He writes verses of his own, filling pages with metaphors drawn from the mountains, the rivers, the scent of orange blossoms carried by evening winds. He becomes not simply a political figure, but a symbol of joy, creativity, and possibility under Lorenzo's leadership. Florence becomes a garden of brilliance. Artists flourish as though they have been waiting for him their entire lives. Botticelli paints visions of myth and elegance. Leonardo da Vinci, still young and restless, experiments with inventions and sketches that defy imagination. Michelangelo, just a boy, studies marble with a seriousness far beyond his years. Scholars debate the nature of the universe. Architects sketch buildings that seem to rise like prayers. Poets find patrons willing not only to fund their work, but to celebrate it. Lorenzo's patronage is not simply financial, it is emotional. He listens to artists speak about their visions, encourages them when they doubt themselves, and protects them when enemies criticize their bold ideas. His support becomes the air they breathe. And yet, beneath all this light, the shadows of politics stretch long and dark. The Medici leadership has always existed on a fine line, embraced by the people, tolerated by rival families, resented by those who feel threatened by their influence. Under Lorenzo, this tension sharpens. Some see his generosity as manipulation. Some accuse him of using beauty as a distraction from power. Some fear that the Medici have grown too strong, too beloved, too essential to Florence's fate. But Lorenzo remains calm, even joyful, because he understands something deeper. Beauty and kindness are not tools of deception. They are tools of connection. And connection is the strongest foundation any leader can build. Yet the greatest challenge of Lorenzo's life emerges not from political rivalries, but from within his own city. An event so shocking that it shakes Florence's soul. The year is 1478, Easter Sunday, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore hums with reverence as families gather under the vast stone dome designed by Brunelleschi. Sunlight pours through stained glass windows, scattering colors across the marble floor. Choir voices rise in harmonies that echo through ancient arches. It is a day of celebration, of peace, of unity. And then chaos erupts. Members of the powerful Parsi family, allied with others who fear Medici influence, launch an assassination attempt right there in the sacred space of the cathedral. Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano are the targets. Giuliano does not survive the attack. Lorenzo, wounded but steady, manages to escape to the sacristy, blood staining his garments as he calls upon Florence to remain calm. The city does not remain calm. Florentines rise in fury not because they love violence, but because they love Lorenzo. They see him as the heart of their home, the guardian of their creativity, the person who allows their city to dream. The attempt on his life feels like a wound to Florence itself. The aftermath shifts the entire political landscape. Lorenzo tightens control over the city, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Enemies fall. Supporters grow in number. Florence becomes more united under him than ever before. And yet, even in grief, even in political turmoil, Lorenzo returns again and again to the thing that defines him: beauty after the attack. He does not retreat into suspicion or cruelty. He creates more art. He writes more poetry. He invites thinkers from across Europe to join him in conversations about the future of humankind. He supports young Michelangelo, offering him a place in the Medici Palace where marble becomes a friend, and imagination becomes a world. He transforms his grief into creation. This is what makes Lorenzo extraordinary. Not that he avoids hardship, but that he transforms it into something luminous. Still, life continues to test him. Wars press upon Florence. Finances strain. Alliances shift. Trade routes falter. And yet he remains composed. His leadership feels like standing in a warm room while a storm rattles the windows outside. Florence feels safe because he is steady, but even the brightest light eventually dims in his final years. Lorenzo's health declines. The once vibrant, laughing, charismatic leader now moves more slowly, his strength fading like the soft glow of a candle burning low. Yet his mind remains sharp. His heart remains open. He continues, guiding Florence toward stability and encouraging the artists who carry the city's future. When Lorenzo dies in 1492, Florence mourns not just a leader, but a father, a friend, a soul whose warmth shaped an era. Churches ring their bells in sorrow. Artists paint in silence. Scholars feel the weight of losing the man who fed their dreams. Even the river Arno seems quieter, as though carrying grief in its currents. With Lorenzo's passing, a chapter closes, a chapter filled with sunlight, music, poetry, and the blossoming of genius. But his legacy does not fade. It becomes part of Florence's breath. It becomes the foundation upon which future generations stand. It becomes the spark that will ignite masterpieces in every corner of the Renaissance. For Lorenzo the Magnificent was not just a ruler. He was a gardener of souls, a cultivator of beauty, a protector of possibility. His life reminds us that leadership is not only about laws or strategies. It is about giving people a reason to believe in the world around them. His generosity shaped a civilization. His kindness shaped history. His brilliance shaped the hearts of those who lived in his time, and those who would come centuries later. And as Florence moves into a new era, with storms on the horizon and uncertainty in the air, the memory of Lorenzo's light becomes its compass, A reminder that beauty can heal. Reminder that creativity can unite. A reminder that magnificence is not an act, it is a way of being. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There are moments in history when light shines so brilliantly that the world forgets, the shadows waiting just beyond its reach. Lorenzo de' Medici's Florence was such a world alive with poetry, art, music, invention, and spiritual rebirth. Yet even as beauty flourished, turbulence stirred beneath the marble floors, behind the frescoed walls, and within the hearts of rivals who envied the Medici glow. For every dawn of magnificence carries an evening of uncertainty, and every great leader must eventually walk through corridors lined with both admiration and suspicion. As Florence basked in the warmth of Lorenzo's guidance, her tension grew quietly in the background, subtle at first, like the slow tightening of a string on a lute. Rival families nursed old resentments. Foreign powers watched Medici rise with wary eyes. Even within the church, ambitions twisted around alliances like vines around an ancient column. The Renaissance was not a peaceful miracle. It was a fragile tapestry held together by talent, diplomacy, and the extraordinary patience of those who believed in something better than power alone. Lorenzo, with his poetic soul and calm presence, understood this more deeply than most. He knew that Florence was beautiful precisely because it was vulnerable. He knew that families like the Pazzi and the Salviati felt threatened by Medici influence. He knew that Rome, Naples, and Milan each had visions for Italy that Florence did not share. And he knew that his own desire to nurture art, literature, and philosophy sometimes unsettled those who valued military strength and political dominance above all else. Yet he continued, choosing to lead with warmth rather than fear. Still, the shadows thickened. After the Pazzi conspiracy erupted in the cathedral, leaving Giuliano dead and Lorenzo wounded, Florence found itself standing between grief and fury. The attack created a wound so deep that its echo carried across Europe. For Lorenzo, the loss of his beloved brother changed the shape of his heart. The joyful youth who once filled the city with laughter now carried a heaviness he did not show but always felt. His smile remained gentle, but his eyes, those thoughtful, searching eyes, carried sorrow like a quiet river flowing beneath stone bridges. He strengthened Florence after the attack, but he also learned a painful truth. Brilliance draws envy, and generosity does not guarantee safety. In the years that followed, Lorenzo faced challenges that tested not only his leadership, but his soul. The Medici Bank began to struggle, weakened by unreliable partners in distant branches and political complications across Europe. The cost of supporting Florence's creative explosion placed strain on the family's finances. Outside threats pressed closer. The King of Naples eyed the city with ambition. Rome shifted in mood from friend to rival. Florence's enemies whispered that the Medici dream had grown too large, too bold, too bright. Yet through every challenge, Lorenzo chose subtlety over force. One of his greatest tests came when tensions with Naples reached a dangerous peak. War seemed unavoidable. Fear spread through Florence like cold mist over the river. People whispered that the city would fall. Yet Lorenzo, refusing to let his homeland become a battleground, did something extraordinary, something that revealed the depth of his courage and his belief in diplomacy. He went to Naples alone. No army, no entourage, no threat, only faith in dialogue. He placed his own life in the hands of a monarch who had every reason to destroy him. And slowly, through conversations shaped by honesty, intelligence, and a profound ability to read human hearts. Lorenzo transformed a potential enemy into an ally. The peace he forged saved Florence. It preserved the Renaissance. It kept Italy from descending into chaos. And when he returned home, the people greeted him not as a politician, but as a guardian, a man who had walked into the shadows and returned with the light. Intact, yet peace always comes with a price. Financial health continued to waver. The Medici Bank, once the strongest in Europe, strained under debts, mismanagement in foreign branches, and political pressures beyond Cosimo's design. Lorenzo saw the storm forming, but he also understood that withdrawing support from artists, students, and thinkers would strip Florence of the soul he had spent his life nurturing. So he continued funding beauty even when it cost him comfort. This decision, both noble and costly, became one of the burdens of greatness. He believed art was not decoration, but meaning. Knowledge was not luxury, but necessity. He knew Michelangelo, Botticelli, Leonardo, and the countless unnamed artisans who filled Florence with genius needed someone to believe in them. And he chose to be that person, even when the price was steep. But the shadows did not retreat. As Lorenzo's influence grew, so too did the unease of foreign rulers and jealous Italian states. They feared his skill, his alliances, his ability to reshape politics without lifting a sword. They feared that Florence, under him, had become not just a city, but an idea too powerful to ignore. And then, slowly but inevitably, a new tension began rising within Florence itself, born not from rival families, but from spiritual anxiety. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola emerged from the cloisters of San Marco, preaching fiery sermons against the moral decay he believed was creeping into the city. His voice carried a force that stirred both fear and fascination. He spoke of simplicity, purity, divine judgment. He condemned wealth, art, poetry, and luxury. He condemned families like the Medici. Lorenzo did not silence him. He allowed Savonarola to speak, believing Florence was strong enough to hold many voices. But Savonaro's influence grew, especially among those who struggled with the contradictions of Renaissance life, beauty and poverty, brilliance and greed, faith and indulgence. Lorenzo watched all of this with a heavy heart. Knowing he was approaching the twilight of his life, his health weakened. The sharpness of his youth softened. Pain clung to his bones. Yet even in illness, he continued guiding Florence gently, like an old tree offering shade until its final breath. He wrote poetry, spoke with artists, mentored young minds, and dreamed of a Florence that would remain bright long after he was gone. There is a moment, often imagined, though never fully recorded, when Lorenzo invited the young Michelangelo to his bedside during his final days. The room was dim, the air scented with herbs meant to ease suffering. Lorenzo's voice, once strong and melodic, grew soft as he encouraged the young sculptor to follow his gift wherever it led. Imagine that one of the greatest patrons of art, offering words of hope to a boy who would one day carve the Peter and the David. In that moment, Lorenzo passed something deeper than advice. He passed the torch of the Renaissance itself. As his final hours approached in 1492, the city outside remained unaware of just how profoundly the world was about to change. Lorenzo's death marked not only the end of a life, but the end of an era, the waning of a golden age shaped by one man's compassion, brilliance, and devotion to beauty. When he died, Florence wept. Bell towers tolled in mourning. Artists fell silent in their workshops. Scholars closed their books in respect. Even the river seemed to deepen its color, carrying sorrow like a dark ribbon through the heart of the city. With Lorenzo's passing, the shadows he had kept at bay began to creep closer. Savonarola's rise gained momentum. Rival powers saw Florence as vulnerable. The Medici family, once anchored by the wisdom of Cosimo and the charisma of Lorenzo, entered years of turbulence and uncertainty. The weight of greatness, once carried gracefully, now passed into the hands of those unprepared for the storms ahead. But even so, the legacy of Lorenzo il Magnifico did not vanish. It lived in the art on every wall, in the philosophy in every library, in the stone arches of public buildings, and in the memories of every heart touched by his gentle leadership. His life became a reminder that power rooted in kindness outlasts power rooted in force. His generosity became a measure for future leaders. His brilliance became a story told for generations. For Florence, the light he brought would forever guide the city even as it entered its darkest chapters. And so, as the petals of the Medici flower begin to wilt in the dusk, the world holds its breath, waiting to see what becomes of the family that once brought sunlight to an entire civilization. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. Catherine was born in 1519, long after Cosimo and Lorenzo, but still in a Florence that vibrated with their legacy. Yet her earliest years were not filled with the gentle security her ancestors once knew. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, died when she was just weeks old. Her mother, Madeleine della Tour de Verni, died soon after. Florence at that time simmered with unrest, and the Medici restored to power by papal influence faced constant threats. The infant Catherine, orphaned but undeniably valuable as a Medici heir, became less a child and more a symbol, one whose life needed protecting, maneuvering, and at times hiding. Imagine her in her earliest memories, surrounded not by the warmth of parents, but by guardians transitioning from palace halls to monasteries, from safe rooms to guarded courtyards. She learned early to observe quietly, to speak only when needed, to read the expressions of adults whose entire lives seemed to twist around her fate. The tension around her did not make her bitter. Instead, it sharpened her awareness. Even as a child, she understood what many adults never learn, that survival requires not noise, but understanding despite the political storms. Catherine's upbringing was filled with the treasures of Medici influence. She learned philosophy and poetry, mathematics, languages, and dance. She read manuscripts copied by monks whose hands trembled with devotion. She walked through gardens designed by master architects, surrounded by sculptures and frescoes that sang the stories of gods and heroes. From Florence she absorbed a love for beauty, structure, innovation, and perhaps most importantly, the power of knowledge. But Florence could not keep her forever. As the Medici navigated alliances and threats, Catherine's value to European dynasties grew. Kings and popes watched her with strategic interest. A marriage to her could unite lands, strengthen treaties, or bridge old rivalries. And in 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine was sent to France to marry Henry, the future king, in a union arranged by her powerful uncle, Pope Clement VII. Imagine the young girl stepping into a world entirely different from Florence. The French court was larger, colder, more theatrical, more political, where Florence was intimate and intellectual. France was glittering and unpredictable, filled with nobles whose smiles hid calculations, whose loyalties shifted like shadows in candlelight. Catherine entered this world quietly, as she always did. Her new husband, Henry, was reserved, shy, and emotionally distant. His heart already belonged to another Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older than him, elegant, confident, and deeply entrenched in court life. Catherine, young and foreign, found herself pushed into the background, but she did not crumble. She learned, she watched, she absorbed the lessons of Florence of Cosimo's restraint, of Lorenzo's diplomacy, of her ancestors' survival in the face of political storms flowed through her. She understood that power was not taken, but built, quietly, patiently, layer upon layer. She understood that in a court where appearances were everything, true influence came from understanding people more deeply than they understood themselves. While Henry and Diane navigated the court's spotlight, Catherine moved in the margins, forming alliances with women, scholars, servants, guards, cooks, anyone with information to offer. She befriended astrologers and philosophers, Italian artists and French nobles, building a network of knowledge that acted like roots beneath the palace. Flaws hidden but vital. Despite years of being ignored by Henry, Catherine remained loyal. She knew that love cannot be forced, but respect can be earned. Slowly, Henry began to acknowledge her strength and intelligence. And as time passed, something extraordinary happened. Catherine, once dismissed as a powerless foreign bride, became central to France's future. When Henry became king in 1547, everything changed. Catherine, now queen, stepped into a role she had been preparing for her whole life, not through ambition, but through necessity. France was a land divided by religious conflict, political factions, and economic instability. The nobility vied for influence. The Protestants and Catholics clashed violently. Foreign powers circled like wolves, and then tragedy struck in 1559. King Henry II died suddenly from a jousting accident, leaving Catherine's 15-year-old son, Francis II, on the throne. Catherine, at just 40, became Queen Mother and, within months, the true center of power in France. Through her son, and later through her younger sons, who would each become king in turn, Catherine became the unofficial ruler of France during one of the most turbulent periods in its history. She guided the country through wars of religion, famine, political conspiracies, and foreign threats. She navigated noble families who sought to claim the throne. She balanced diplomacy with firmness, intuition with strategy, compassion with pragmatism. And though history sometimes paints her as shadowy, the truth is simpler and more human. She did what she believed necessary to prevent France from tearing itself apart. Her childhood lessons, watching, listening, surviving, became tools sharper and more valuable than any weapon. Imagine her standing in the dimly lit halls of the Louvre, studying documents by candlelight while the sounds of unrest echoed outside. Imagine her negotiating with nobles whose ambitions could fracture the kingdom. Imagine her stepping into a council chamber where men twice her age doubted her, only to leave convinced by her intelligence and foresight. Catherine did not rule with cruelty. She ruled with endurance. Yet time was not kind to her reputation. Rumors, fueled by rivals and dramatized by centuries of storytellers, cast her as sinister. Some accused her of poisoning, witchcraft, manipulation, even when evidence was absent. These accusations grew not from truth, but from fear. For, in a world where women were expected to remain silent, a woman who shaped the fate of nations appeared threatening. But those who look closely see a different Catherine, a mother trying desperately to protect her children in a world that tore kings apart. A queen trying to preserve a country on the edge of ruin. A Medici who carried the Renaissance into France, influencing its architecture, cuisine, fashion, gardens, art, and culture more profoundly than most monarchs ever could. She introduced Italian chefs to the French court, influencing the beginnings of what we now call French cuisine. She shaped the layout of French gardens, bringing the symmetry and elegance of her Florentine youth. She encouraged art, science, and astronomy. She founded academies and supported scholars. Even in crisis, she never abandoned beauty. It is here that her Medici spirit shines brightest, not in battlefields or political plots, but in her belief that culture strengthens a nation. She brought with her the wisdom of Cosimo, the diplomacy of Lorenzo, the creative fire of Florence. Through her, the Medici legacy flowed into France like a river crossing mountains as Catherine aged. The burdens she carried only grew heavier. She outlived several of her children, navigated more war than peace, and watched France fracture again and again despite her efforts to hold it together. But she never surrendered to despair. Even in her final years, she traveled tirelessly across the kingdom, negotiating, mediating, soothing, persuading, doing everything in her power to prevent the complete collapse of the monarchy. When she died in 1589, exhausted by decades of leadership, France stood at a crossroads, but still standing. In part because of her relentless endurance, Catherine de' Medici, once the orphaned girl hidden during Florence's uprisings, died as one of the most influential women in European history. Her legacy is complicated, but it is vast. She was a queen, a mother of kings, a diplomat, a protector, a survivor, and a vessel carrying the Renaissance beyond the Tuscan hills into a kingdom that desperately needed order and imagination. Her life was not peaceful, but it was profound. Her strength was not flashy, but it was unbreakable. Her journey reminds us that power can come from patience, that leadership can come from listening, and that greatness often comes from surviving hardships no one else can see. She was a Medici through her. The winds of Florence touch the crown of France. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There are turning points in history when the sacred and the political intertwine so closely that they become threads of the same tapestry. For the Medici family, whose origins bloomed in the markets and workshops of Florence, the rise to power within the spiritual heart of Europe marked a transformation unlike anything the world had seen. From bankers to patrons, from patrons to statesmen, and finally from statesmen to popes. It is here, within the echoing halls of the Vatican and beneath the glow of frescoed ceilings, that the Medici story takes on a new resonance, one both powerful and delicate. As soft as a prayer whispered beneath vaulted arches, the idea of a Medici pope might once have seemed impossible. The Medici were merchants, financiers, craftsmen of influence, not priests born into centuries of ecclesiastical tradition. Yet as Florence grew, as Lorenzo shaped its culture, as Cosimo shaped its diplomacy, and as Renaissance ideas spread like dawn across Europe, the Medici name began to carry weight far beyond Tuscany. It carried stability. It carried intelligence. It carried creativity. And in a world where the Church sought leaders who could guide nations, negotiate peace, and manage the wealth of Christendom, the Medici offered something rare, both worldly expertise and a vision of harmony. But this chapter unfolds not in Florence, but in Rome, a city older, heavier, and more burdened by the echoes of empires. Rome in the early 1500s, was a place of tension and splendor, where ancient ruins stood beside rising palaces, and where faith and power danced closely, often uncomfortably. Cardinals moved through marble corridors with robes sweeping across mosaic floors. Scholars discussed theology under candlelight. Artists labored over grand commissions intended to glorify both God and the patrons who funded them. And in this world, to Medici, Giovanni, and Julio would rise to the highest spiritual office on earth. To understand their ascent, one must return briefly to the days of Lorenzo il Magnifico, for it is in his nurturing that these future popes first discovered their paths. Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, grew up surrounded by poets and philosophers, absorbing the sounds of debate, the rhythms of verse, and the beauty of Florence's cultural golden age. From a young age, he was destined for the church, not because he lacked the intelligence for finance or diplomacy, but because Lorenzo understood that the Medici family's future required roots not only in Florence, but in Rome. Giovanni entered the clergy at an early age, and by 13 he was a cardinale, so young for its gravity that it reveals not vanity, but the extent of Medici influence. Yet Giovanni's youth did not diminish his commitment. He studied theology, law, Latin, philosophy. He observed papal politics with the keen eye of a statesman. He learned how councils worked, how alliances formed, and how spiritual authority interplayed with political responsibility. Years later, in 1513, after turbulent papal struggles and moments of uncertainty, Giovanni ascended to the papacy as Pope Leo X ***. To imagine his coronation is to imagine a world blossoming with color, banners fluttering, choirs soaring through basilicas, trumpets calling, gold embroideries shimmering like sunlight upon water. When Leo X took his place upon the papal throne, he carried with him not only the responsibilities of the church, but the legacy of Florence, the love of art, of learning, of culture, of balance. His reign would come to define a crucial movement in the Renaissance, one that elevated the arts, but also faced trials that would alter the course of Christian history. Pope Leo X was first and foremost a patron of beauty. He believed deeply that art could express faith more vividly than doctrine alone. Under his guidance, Rome became a living gallery. He commissioned works that shimmered with genius. He supported Raphael, whose brush transformed walls into windows into heaven. He continued the work on St. Peter's Basilica, shaping it into the architectural miracle it would one day become. He invited philosophers, poets, and scholars to enrich the intellectual lungs of the papacy. Yet every light casts shadows, and Leo X's love for art and pageantry sometimes strained the papal treasury. His desire to celebrate beauty to fill churches with music, sculpture, and fresco required funding. And in a world still emerging from medieval austerity, these expenses raised questions. Tensions simmered between the spiritual purity expected from the church and the worldly expenditures that defined Renaissance aesthetics. And then came the spark that would ignite a storm: the rise of Martin Luther, the Protestant. Reformation was not born of a single moment, but of centuries of dissatisfaction. However, under Pope Leo X, the movement took form, finding its voice in the anger, frustration, and longing many felt for reform. Luther challenged indulgences, authority, doctrine. His words spread quickly through newly emerging printing presses, and soon Europe trembled under the weight of division. Leo X responded as a man caught between faith and politics, striving to preserve unity while confronting escalating resistance. Some criticized him for not addressing Luther more swiftly. Others argued he acted too harshly. But the deeper truth is more human. Leo X faced a crisis no pope could have fully prepared for, a crisis not of politics alone, but of spiritual identity, one that would fracture the Christian world forever. His papacy ended in 1521, leaving behind a legacy of artistic brilliance and spiritual turbulence. Yet the Medici presence in the church did not fade. 6 years later, another Medici ascended to the papacy, Giulio de' Medici, who would become Pope Clement VII. Giulio's path had been shaped by loss, loyalty, and resilience. He was the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano, who was murdered during the Pazzi conspiracy. Raised by Lorenzo, he inherited not only Florence's intellectual culture, but also the Medici instinct for political survival. As a cardinal, he served under multiple popes, mastering the delicate balance between diplomacy and firmness. When Clement VII became pope in 1523, he inherited a Europe far more volatile than the one Leo X had known. The Protestant Reformation spread. Monarchs like Henry VIII of England challenged papal authority. Spain and France, two giants, clashed repeatedly. Italy had become a battlefield for empires. Clement VII was intelligent, cautious, thoughtful, but the world around him was in upheaval. One of the greatest tragedies of his papacy came in 1527, the sack of Rome. This brutal event, carried out by mutinous imperial troops, devastated the city, destroyed centuries of art and culture, and left Rome in ruins. Clement VII himself narrowly escaped, seeking refuge and surviving only through quick negotiation and profound emotional endurance. The pain of watching the holy city suffer under violence etched itself deeply into his spirit. Yet even amid devastation, Clement VII sought restoration. He worked tirelessly to rebuild Rome, encourage artists, negotiate peace, and maintain unity in a world whose foundations trembled. He commissioned Michelangelo to complete The Last Judgment, one of the greatest masterpieces in history. He arranged politically crucial marriages, including that of his relative Catherine de' Medici to Henry, future King of France. If Leo X represented the flourishing of Renaissance beauty, Clement VII represented resilience, the effort to preserve faith and culture against overwhelming forces. And through both popes, the Medici family left an imprint on the spiritual history of Europe, not merely in wealth or power, but in their belief that culture, imagination, and learning could elevate the human soul. They brought Florence's love of art into the Vatican. They encouraged architecture that reached toward heaven. They ensured that the Renaissance born in their city became a chapter written across Europe. But their presence also sparked conflict, resistance, misunderstanding. For when a family accustomed to shaping politics enters the realm of spiritual leadership, the world reacts with uncertainty. Some celebrated their brilliance, others feared their influence. Yet history shows that they shaped a papacy deeply connected to human expression, faith, and intellectual curiosity. As the Medici popes aged and passed into memory, the echoes of their influence lingered in the halls of Rome. Their legacy lived in every sculpted marble column, every frescoed chapel ceiling, every library filled with manuscripts they helped preserve. For the Medici did not simply guide Florence, they touched the very heart of Christendom. They shaped the Renaissance, not only as patrons of beauty, but as leaders of faith. Their impact traveled farther than any merchant caravan, farther than any alliance or political negotiation. It traveled into the soul of Europe. And now, as the story continues. Florence prepares for the final acts of Medici, history acts filled with fading glory, rising uncertainty, and the quiet approach of an ending no one could stop. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There are times in human history when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting not for kings or conquerors, but for artists, those quiet visionaries who shape reality with imagination rather than force. Florence, under the Medici, became such a place. A city not merely of markets and guilds, but of inspiration, where the boundaries of human potential stretched wider with every stroke of a brush, every curve of marble, every daring architectural dream. And at the heart of this extraordinary blossoming stood the Medici family, nurturing genius with a tenderness rarely seen among powerful dynasties. To understand this chapter is to step into the very soul of the Renaissance, place where the human spirit awakened from centuries of slumber, stretching its limbs beneath the warm Tuscan sun. It is to hear music drifting from open windows, mixing with the murmur of scholars debating ancient texts. It is to feel the excitement of discovery as doctors, astronomers, engineers, and poets share ideas that ripple across the world. Florence was no ordinary city. It was a dream made real, a garden where every seed of creativity found fertile ground. The Medici were not merely observers of this miracle. They were its gardeners, Cosimo. Piero, Lorenzo, and their descendants understood something profound, that beauty nourishes the mind, that knowledge strengthens the future, and that supporting artists is not a luxury, but a responsibility. Through their patronage, Florence became a sanctuary for those who dared to imagine something greater than themselves. Under their protection, the greatest names in Western art found not just funding, but safety, encouragement, and a sense of belonging. Picture a young Michelangelo entering the Medici palace under Lorenzo's guidance. A quiet boy, thin and serious, carrying sketches that seemed to breathe with life. Lorenzo saw not merely talent, but destiny. He invited Michelangelo to dine with scholars and poets, to study the ancient statues Cosimo had collected, to immerse himself in an environment where art was not an afterthought, but a language of the divine. The Medici home, filled with laughter, debate, and music, became Michelangelo's second family. It was here that he learned to soften marble into flesh, to carve sorrow and triumph into stone, to create works that would echo through centuries. The Medici did not ask him to flatter them. They asked him to become himself, and he did. But Michelangelo was only one flame among many. There was Botticelli, whose paintings shimmered like dreams half remembered. His figures moved with ethereal grace, their faces touched by melancholy and wonder. Under Medici patronage, he painted scenes not merely of mythology, but of the human soul, stories of birth and transformation, of spiritual longing, of beauty both fragile and eternal. The birth of Venus, rising from the sea, became more than an image. It became a symbol of the Renaissance, its self-rebirth emerging from the waves of a darkened age. Then there was Leonardo da Vinci, a mind so vast and curious that it seemed to belong to the future rather than his own time. Though Leonardo's relationship with Florence was complex and ever-shifting, his interactions with the Medici shaped the early stages of his genius. They recognized his brilliance even when others hesitated, offering him opportunities to experiment with inventions, studies, and artistic techniques that blended science with imagination. Leonardo was not simply an artist. He was a philosopher of the visible world, a man who saw shapes in clouds, anatomy in shadows, and mechanical wonders in the flight of birds. The Medici nurtured this curiosity because they knew curiosity was the spark of human evolution. And there were so many others: sculptors, mathematicians, poets, playwrights, engineers. Each carried a flame, and the Medici sheltered these flames from the winds of poverty, political unrest, and societal expectations. In doing so, they transformed Florence into the beating heart of European culture under their patronage. Filippo Brunelleschi built the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a marvel of engineering that defied gravity and imagination. The dome rose above the city like a great stone lantern, glowing with the promise of human possibility. From every direction, it reminded Florentines that the sky was not a limit, but an invitation. Brunelleschi's dome was not simply an architectural triumph. It was a statement that Florence believed in the future. Similarly, Donatello, one of the earliest giants of Renaissance sculpture, found encouragement within Medici circles. His David, graceful and contemplative, became the first freestanding nude statue created since antiquity. In its relaxed posture and youthful confidence, one can see the spirit of a world rediscovering itself, reclaiming its past, and shaping something entirely new. The Medici did not create these masterpieces, but they created the world where these masterpieces could exist. Their palaces became museums before museums existed. Their gardens became open-air classrooms. Their private collections inspired generations of thinkers. Their conversations, gentle, philosophical, curious, guided artists toward deeper reflection. Even their political gatherings often included poets and scholars, because to the Medici, governance was not merely the management of people, but the shaping of civilization. But this flame of creativity, brilliant as it was, flickered in a world often hostile to art. The Renaissance did not exist without tension. There were those who believed beauty distracted from faith, those who believed questioning the natural world was dangerous, those who feared the power of new ideas, those who saw the Medici's support of thinkers as subversive or elitist. And, of course, there were the constant pressures of political conflict, wars, alliances, conspiracies that threatened to unravel the delicate web of stability that allowed creativity to flourish. Yet the artists continued, because the Medici continued, even during periods of exile and political upheaval. Medici influence on art persisted. When they were forced out of Florence, artists mourned not simply patronage, but friendship. When they returned, creativity blossomed anew. Their presence was not merely financial. It was emotional. It was spiritual. Artists knew that the Medici believed in beauty not as decoration, but as truth. As the years passed, Medici patronage shaped not only Florence but the world. Their support helped lay the foundation of modern science. Their libraries preserved ancient texts that would have been lost. Their sponsorship of astronomers, anatomists, linguists, and mathematicians fueled discoveries that reshaped human understanding. One could argue that without the Medici, the Renaissance might still have occurred, but it would not have been the same Renaissance. Not as rich, not as bold, not as deeply intertwined with the human heart. Yet as the 1500s progressed, the flames of genius flickered against rising winds. Political instability weakened Florence. Foreign powers vied for control of Italy. The Protestant Reformation fractured the religious unity that once allowed artistic commissions to flourish freely. Even the Vatican, once a beacon of artistic grandeur under Medici popes, faced growing financial strain and political criticism. Still, The artists created because the Medici stood behind them in the quieter corners of Florence. During evenings when the sky blushed violet and lanterns glowed softly against stone walls, scholars gathered to read ancient poetry. Musicians practiced lutes beneath arched windows. Students sketched statues in dimly lit halls. It was in these quiet spaces that the flame of the Renaissance endured. It was here that the Medici legacy became not just political or economic, but spiritually inheritance of wonder. For the Renaissance, at its core, was not about wealth or patronage. It was about belief. Belief that humans could understand the world more deeply. Belief that beauty mattered. Belief that ideas could transform existence. And the Medici, through their constant nurturing, helped make this belief a cultural heartbeat felt across centuries. But as we reach the end of this chapter, the light begins to dim. The Renaissance does not fade abruptly. It softens, like a sunset stretching across the sky before surrendering to night. Florence, once the dazzling center of Europe, begins to face the quiet, creeping weight of change. The Medici family, after generations of brilliance, confronts new challenges: economic, political, spiritual. The flames they nurtured still burn, but the world around them grows less steady. Ahead lie chapters of decline, resilience, and the final glow of a world once sung into existence by genius. But the art remains, the dreams remain, the legacy remains, and because of that, the Medici remain forever intertwined with the flame of Renaissance souls, glowing gently through time. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. Every great story carries with it not only the glow of triumph, but also the quiet tremor of decline, a soft unraveling that follows even the brightest eras. The Medici family, who once shaped Florence like sculptors shaping marble, reached a point in their long history when the radiant flame of the Renaissance dimmed, and shadows crept gently across the golden legacy they had spent centuries building. Their influence began to wane, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow fading. Like the last light of day slipping behind Tuscan hills. To understand this turning point, one must imagine Florence after the age of Michelangelo, after the days when Lorenzo's laughter filled palazzo halls, after the Medici popes navigated faith and politics with trembling hands. The city still held beauty, its domes, its frescoes, its palaces, but beneath that beauty lay fatigue. Wars drained its coffers. Trade routes shifted across Europe. New empires rose, pushing Italy's once dominant city-states into the background. And the Medici, who had once danced gracefully across the stage of history, began to struggle beneath the weight of expectations, too heavy for their weakened shoulders. The decline did not begin dramatically. It began quietly, in small changes barely noticed at first. The bank's weakening branches, the cautious whispers of merchants losing trust, subtle political tensions rising between the people and their rulers. Florence transformed from a republic shaped by civic pride into a duchy controlled by hereditary power. And though the Medici still sat upon the throne, the spirit of Cosimo and Lorenzo, the spirit of nurturing, generosity, and humility became harder to find. After Lorenzo the Magnificent, the leadership passed to his son Piero, known to history as Piero the Unfortunate. His rule lasted only 2 years, but left scars that reverberated through the decades. When France invaded Italy under Charles VIII, Piero made concessions that outraged Florence. In a city that valued courage, he appeared weak. In a city that valued independence, he surrendered too quickly. In a city raised by Medici brilliance, he dimmed the torch. The people rose, for the first time in generations. Florence expelled the Medici. It was a painful exile, one that marked the beginning of a long and complicated dance between the family and their beloved city, a dance of return and expulsion, loyalty and resentment, longing and disappointment. During their absence, Florence fell under the influence of the fiery Dominican preacher whose voice thundered against the luxuries and decadence of Renaissance life. He condemned art, poetry, learning, and beauty, everything the Medici had nurtured. Under his influence, the city erupted into an almost feverish puritanical state. Bonfires consumed paintings, jewelry, manuscripts, instruments, silk garments, objects of elegance that had defined Florence's identity. In these flames, one can almost hear the sound of Medici dreams turning to ashes. Yet the Medici story did not end there. History rarely closes its chapters so abruptly. After a few years, the political pendulum swung again. Savonarola's extremism pushed Florence into turmoil, and when he himself fell from grace, Florence, exhausted and directionless, found itself nostalgic for the stability the Medici once provided. And so, the Medici returned, but the Florence they came back to was not the Florence they had left. The Renaissance glow had faded. The people were wary. The Europe surrounding them was shifting rapidly. The family, once united by vision, was now splintered by ambition, weakness, and internal conflict. Into this fractured world rose a new Medici leader, Cosimo I, great-grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother. Young, determined, and strategic, Cosimo, I understood that if the Medici were to survive, they needed not only political power, but an identity that transcended Florence's internal divisions. He transformed the Medici from simple rulers of a city into dukes, and eventually grand dukes, of the larger region of Tuscany. Under Cosimo I, Florence regained its footing. New buildings rose. Military strength increased. Administrative systems improved. Cosimo I commissioned the Uffiziata, great administrative and artistic complex that still stands today as a monument to Medici ambition. He encouraged science and navigation, preparing Tuscany for a world expanding across oceans. But even as Cosimo, I breathed life into a struggling dynasty. The soul of the Renaissance was slipping away. Art became more mannered, less spiritual. Innovation slowed. The Medici no longer guided a cultural revolution. They maintained a political state. And this change, though practical, signaled a deeper transition. The Medici were no longer creators of genius. They were caretakers of nostalgia. Generations passed. The Medici Grand Dukes who followed Cosimo I were capable, but not extraordinary. Some ruled with discipline, others with extravagance. Some strengthened the state, others weakened it. But none possessed the visionary spark of their ancestors. None carried the gentle brilliance of Cosimo the Elder, the poetic fire of Lorenzo, the patronage of the popes, or the resilience of Catherine. By the 1600s, the cracks widened. Every great story carries with it not only the glow of triumph, but also the quiet tremor of decline, soft unraveling that follows even the brightest eras. The Medici family, who once shaped Florence like sculptors shaping marble, reached a point in their long history when the radiant flame of the Renaissance dimmed, and shadows crept gently across the golden legacy they had spent centuries building. Their influence began to wane, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow fading, like the last light of day slipping behind Tuscan hills. To understand this turning point, one must imagine Florence after the age of Michelangelo. After the days when Lorenzo's laughter filled palazzo halls. After the Medici popes navigated faith and politics with trembling hands. The city still held beauty, its domes, its frescoes, its palaces, but beneath that beauty lay fatigue. Wars drained its coffers. Trade routes shifted across Europe. New empires rose, pushing Italy's once dominant city-states into the background. And the Medici, who had once danced gracefully across the stage of history, began to struggle beneath the weight of expectations too, heavy for their weakened shoulders. The decline did not begin dramatically. It began quietly, in small changes barely noticed at first. The bank's weakening branches, the cautious whispers of merchants losing trust, subtle political tensions rising between the people and their rulers. Florence transformed from a republic shaped by civic pride into a duchy controlled by hereditary power. And though the Medici still sat upon the throne, the spirit of Cosimo and Lorenzo, the spirit of nurturing, generosity, and humility became harder to find. After Lorenzo the Magnificent, the leadership passed to his son Piero, known to history as Piero the Unfortunate. His rule lasted only 2 years, but left scars that reverberated through the decades. When France invaded Italy under Charles VIII, Piero made concessions that outraged Florence. In a city that valued courage, he appeared weak. In a city that valued independence, he surrendered too quickly. In a city raised by Medici brilliance, he dimmed the torch. The people rose. For the first time in generations, Florence expelled the Medici. Economic decline set in as Northern Europe surpassed Italy in trade and technology. The Mediterranean, once the heart of commerce, lost its centrality. Florence's political relevance shrank, and the Medici, now entrenched in nobility, began to mirror the aristocracies they once surpassed through talent rather than birthright. Inside their palaces, life grew quieter. Portraits replaced political maps. Jewels replaced ledgers. Scholars still visited, but the conversations no longer shaped the world. Artists came, but the masterpieces lacked the raw force of Renaissance passion. The Medici lived among the ghosts of their own greatness, surrounded by marble, tapestries, and distant echoes of glory. The decline deepened as internal fractures grew. The family line weakened, plagued by infertility, early deaths, and rivalries. Leadership passed not to the strongest or wisest, but to whoever remained. In a family once defined by vision, the later Medici rulers seemed lost in time-born, into privilege but untouched by genius, and beyond palace walls. The world continued to change. Empires rose in France, Spain, and later Britain. Scientific revolutions redefined understanding. New philosophies questioned old structures. Florence, once the birthplace of modern thought, now found itself observing from the sidelines. Its influence waned, its voice quieted, its shine dulled, but decline is never purely sorrow. There is a beauty in watching eras pass, a softness in seeing once powerful families return to the simplicity from which they came. In the quieter centuries, the Medici did not vanish, they transformed. They became collectors rather than creators, patrons of preservation rather than patrons of innovation. They protected Florence's art from decay. They ensured that manuscripts were not lost. They funded restorations. They maintained the memory of the Renaissance even when they could no longer ignite a new one. The last generations of Medici Grand Dukes lived lives filled with ceremony but lacking purpose. Their palaces echoed with footsteps of servants polishing treasures that belonged to a different age. Their gardens, once full of philosophers, now held only statues. Their libraries grew dusty, their audiences thinned, and yet, through it all, they preserved the beauty their ancestors had gifted to the world. By the early 1700s, the Medici line approached its end. The once glorious family dwindled to a few remaining members, none capable of securing an heir. The halls that once rang with children's laughter and artist debates now felt hollow. The great dynasty that had shaped Italy influenced Europe, and transformed human culture stood on the brink of silent extinction. And still, Florence remembered. The cycle of rise and fall is not cruel, it is natural. The Medici had burned with brilliance for nearly 300 years, shaping art, politics, science, religion, and philosophy. Their decline did not erase their greatness. It only marked the closing of a chapter that had lasted longer than most empires. As the last embers of their power faded, Florence carried the spark forward, for the Renaissance remained. The domes remained. The paintings, sculptures, libraries, gardens, academies, and ideas remained. The world they nurtured full of creativity, exploration, and wonder remained. Decline may dim a flame, but it cannot erase the fire that once warmed the world. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. It was a painful exile, one that marked the beginning of a long and complicated dance between the family and their beloved city, a dance of return and expulsion, loyalty and resentment, longing and disappointment. During their absence, Florence fell under the influence of Savon, the fiery Dominican preacher whose voice thundered against the luxuries and decadence of Renaissance life. He condemned art, poetry, learning, and beauty, everything the Medici had nurtured. Under his influence, the city erupted into an almost feverish puritanical state. Bonfires consumed paintings, jewelry, manuscripts, instruments, silk garments, subjects of elegance that had defined Florence's identity. In these flames, one can almost hear the sound of Medici dreams turning to ashes. Yet the Medici story did not end there. History rarely closes its chapters so abruptly. After a few years, the political pendulum swung again. Savonarola's extremism pushed Florence into turmoil, and when he himself fell from grace, Florence, exhausted and directionless, found itself nostalgic for the stability the Medici once provided. And so, the Medici returned. But the Florence they came back to was not the Florence they had left. The Renaissance glow had faded. The people were wary. The Europe surrounding them was shifting rapidly. The family, once united by vision, was now splintered by ambition, weakness, and internal conflict. Into this fractured world rose a new Medici leader, Cosimo I, great-grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother. Young, determined, and strategic, Cosimo I understood that if the Medici were to survive, they needed not only political power, but an identity that transcended Florence's internal divisions. He transformed the Medici from simple rulers of a city into dukes, and eventually Grand Dukes, of the larger region of Tuscany. Under Cosimo I, Florence regained its footing. New buildings rose. Military strength increased. Administrative systems improved. Cosimo I commissioned the Uffizita, great administrative and artistic complex that still stands today as a monument to Medici ambition. He encouraged science and navigation, preparing Tuscany for a world expanding across oceans. But even as Cosimo, I breathed life into a struggling dynasty. The soul of the Renaissance was slipping away. Art became more mannered, less spiritual. Innovation slowed. The Medici no longer guided a cultural revolution. They maintained a political state. And this change, though practical, signaled a deeper transition. The Medici were no longer creators of genius. They were caretakers of nostalgia, generations past. The Medici, Grand Dukes who followed Cosimo I were capable, but not extraordinary. Some ruled with discipline, others with extravagance. Some strengthened the state, others weakened it. But none possessed the visionary spark of their ancestors. None carried the gentle brilliance of Cosimo the Elder, the poetic fire of Lorenzo, the patronage of the popes, or the resilience of Catherine. By the 1600s, the cracks widened. There are moments in history when an entire era gathers itself into the life of a single person, the way dusk gathers the last colors of the sky before fading into night. The story of the Medici reaches such a moment with the final Grand Duke, Juan Gaston de' Medici. His life, quiet and sorrowful, stands as the closing movement of a long and intricate symphony. Through him, the Medici legacy breathes its final human breath before transforming into memory, marble, and legend. To understand his story is to walk slowly through rooms that were once filled with music, debate, and the bright laughter of artists. By the early 1700s, the Medici palaces had grown still. Their walls still shimmered with the beauty collected over centuries. But the air inside felt heavy, as if the echoes of genius had retreated into silence. The Medici name still carried weight, but it was a weight of nostalgia rather than influence. And in the middle of this quiet stood Guillaume Gaston, the last of a dynasty that had shaped the world. Born in 1671 to Grand Duke Cosimo III and Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, Guillaume Gaston arrived in a Florence no longer lit by the fierce glow of the Renaissance. The age of Michelangelo, Botticelli, Galileo, and Leonardo had long passed. Europe had changed. The Enlightenment had begun. New powers rose, new ideas spread, and Florence watched from the shadows as other nations claimed the spotlight. Guillaume Gaston grew up in an environment marked not by innovation, but by tension between a strict father and a mother who longed for freedom, between old expectations and new realities, between the weight of a fading legacy and the personal fragility of a man born into a role he never desired. Imagine him as a child wandering through the vast corridors of Palazzo Pitti, surrounded by portraits of Medici ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him. Cosimo, the elder with his quiet wisdom, Lorenzo the Magnificent with his poetic brilliance, Catherine with her determined gaze. Guillaume Gaston felt these ancestors not as sources of pride but as burdens. How could anyone live up to such names, especially in a time when Florence no longer held the power it once did? The scale of the Medici past pressed upon him like the thick velvet curtains that hung from the palace windows. Unlike rulers shaped by ambition, Guillaume Gaston was shaped by introspection. He was intelligent, well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply curious about the world beyond the Tuscan hills. He longed for conversation, philosophy, travel, but the rigid expectations of the court, combined with the strained marriage of his parents, created an environment where his spirit felt confined. Eventually, his mother left Florence and returned to France, leaving Guillaume Gaston emotionally adrift. His father, Cosimo III, was devout to the point of severity. Under his rule, Florence imposed strict moral laws, closing taverns early, restricting festivals, and limiting the lively social life that had once defined the city. Music softened, gatherings dwindled, and the once vibrant Florentine culture fell into a kind of spiritual winter. Guillaume Gaston found little joy in this atmosphere. He began to withdraw into books, private gardens, and long periods of silence as he grew older. He was pushed into a marriage with Anna Maria, Franziska of Saxenia, union arranged for political stability but devoid of affection. The two were painfully mismatched. She was reportedly domineering, harsh, and uninterested in Guillaume Gaston's intellectual passions. Their marriage produced no children, further dimming the hopes of a Medici continuation. Within a short time, Guillaume Gaston fled the marriage and lived separately, carrying with him the quiet shame of a failed union and the growing certainty that he did not fit the mold of a Grand Duke. When his father died in 1723, Guillaume Gaston reluctantly ascended to the role of the seventh and final Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany. Florence watched with uncertainty. They knew his past struggles, but they also sensed something gentle in him, something different from the increasingly rigid and ineffective rulers who preceded him. And indeed, Guillaume Gaston surprised them. He began his reign by reversing many of Cosimo III's restrictive laws. He reopened taverns, lifted bans on music and social gatherings, encouraged intellectual exchange, and restored a measure of warmth to Florentine life. The people, long stifled by harsh regulation, felt the air loosen. Laughter returned to the streets. Art and conversation regained a modest glow. Though Guillaume Gaston lacked the grandeur of Lorenzo or the vision of Cosimo the Elder, he carried a quiet understanding of what ordinary people needed. Not monuments, but relief. Not spectacle, but kindness. Underneath his gentle reforms, however, lay the fragile truth. Guillaume Gaston had no heirs. He was the last branch of a once mighty tree. He spent his days in elegant but lonely rooms, surrounded by servants and companions who rarely understood the depth of his sadness. Evenings passed in libraries lit by flickering candles, where he often read old Medici letters and manuscripts, words penned by ancestors who had once commanded armies, shaped empires, guided popes, and transformed art. Imagine him sitting alone before a fireplace, holding a book written by Lorenzo il Magnifico, reading poems about love, fate, and the fleeting nature of life. One wonders whether he felt comfort or pain in those pages, whether he saw himself as the gentle dusk after a brilliant day, or as the quiet note concluding a symphony no longer heard by many. As years passed, Guillaume Gaston's health weakened. He suffered from physical ailments, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of futility that settled upon him like mist over the Arno. Yet despite his struggles, he maintained a measure of dignity. He refused cruelty. He avoided unnecessary conflict. He cared for the poor with sincerity. In his own small, fragile way, he carried the Medici spirit of compassion, if he lacked their strength. His decline mirrored that of Florence itself. The city was peaceful but stagnant, beautiful but fading, elegant but aging. The Renaissance structures remained, but the spirit behind them felt distant. The Medici armies had shrunk. Their political influence had evaporated. Their alliances had thinned. The world moved around them, leaving Tuscany a quiet corner of an increasingly interconnected Europe. When Guillaume Gaston's final days approached in 1737, the palace grew strangely still. Servants moved softly through the halls. Physicians whispered behind closed doors. Rumors spread through Florence that the last Medici was dying. In taverns and marketplaces, people spoke about him with a tenderness rare for rulers. He was kind, many said. He did not burden us. For a dynasty that had once commanded fear, respect, and envy, it was touching that their final representative was remembered with gentleness. In his final evening, Guillaume Gaston reportedly lay in a chamber surrounded by portraits of his ancestors, a visual tapestry of centuries. Perhaps he glanced at Cosimo the Elder and wondered how such a legacy began. Perhaps he looked up at the serene face of Lorenzo and imagined the music and poetry of a world long gone. Perhaps he felt the presence of Catherine, who once commanded the French throne. Perhaps he thought of the popes, the artists, the scholars, the explorers, the dreamers who had lived under the Medici wing. Outside, Florence exhaled softly. The city lights flickered against the river. The great dome of the cathedral glowed faintly in the night sky. The bells remained silent, waiting, and then, quietly, so quietly that history barely recorded the moment Guillaume Gaston de Medici took his last breath. With that breath, the Medici bloodline ended. 3 centuries of brilliance, struggle, vision, ambition, art, beauty, controversy, faith, diplomacy, and survival came to its human close. But something extraordinary happened after his death. Florence did not fall into despair. Instead, it entered a period of preservation. Guillaume Gaston's sister, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the last surviving member of the family, made a decision that would shape the world for centuries to come. In her famous family pact, she ensured that all Medici treasures, paintings, manuscripts, sculptures, jewels, instruments, architecture would remain in Florence forever. Never sold, never removed, never scattered across Europe with one act of love. She ensured that the Medici story, though ending in life, would live eternally through art. Guillaume Gaston's death may have closed the last chapter of the dynasty's human journey, but it opened a new journey of memory. The city he left behind still held the beauty crafted under his ancestors. The museums, the palaces, the gardens, the libraries all stood as living tributes to a family that began as humble bankers and rose to shape the destiny of civilizations. In the soft quiet of his final evening, one can almost hear a whisper, perhaps from the spirit of the Medici themselves, reminding the world that greatness does not vanish. It transforms. It becomes part of the stones beneath our feet, the paintings that move our hearts, the ideas that shape our minds, the music that stirs our dreams. The Medici were gone, but their legacy remained woven through marble dust and memory, glowing gently through the centuries like the last embers of a magnificent fire. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. History rarely ends when a life ends, nor does a dynasty truly disappear when its final member closes their eyes. Instead, stories continue like rivers weaving through new landscapes, reshaping the land long after the source has dried. So it is with the Medici family. Though their bloodline slipped quietly into the past with the death of Guillaume Gaston, and later the final passing of Anna Maria Luisa, their presence never left Florence. It lingers in the arches, the stones, the light, the art, the very breath of the city itself. And if one listens closely, especially in the soft, drowsy hours of twilight, one can still hear the Medici whispering through time to understand their legacy. Imagine Florence at dawn. The first rays of sunlight crawl gently over the cathedral's dome, designed by Brunelleschi's dome that should never have existed. a dome that defied mathematics and fear, a dome that rose only because the Medici believed in the impossible. The terracotta tiles glow warm, like embers from an ancient fire. Swallows cut through the cool air. The river Arno carries shimmering reflections along its surface. Traders set up stalls in narrow streets, once walked by Lorenzo Cosimo, and the countless artists they nurtured that. This is the Florence the Medici left behind. Not a kingdom, not an empire, but a masterpiece. Their legacy is not carved into thrones those crumble. It is carved into marble and ink, into minds awakened, into revolutions of thought, into quiet acts of patronage that blossomed into revolutions of beauty, into scientific curiosity that pushed beyond the limits of the medieval world, into architecture, philosophy, diplomacy, medicine, astronomy, sculpture, poetry, and the subtle yet powerful art of believing in people before the rest of the world sees their value. When Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici signed the family pact, she did something extraordinary. She ensured that everything the Medici had gathered, protected, purchased, or inspired across centuries would remain in Florence forever. She offered not wealth, but inheritance, cultural inheritance for all humanity. Because of her, when one walks through the Uffizi today, or stands before Botticelli's Venus, or gazes at the sculptures that once adorned Medici gardens, one is witnessing not just art, but gratitude preserved across time. It is easy to look at the Medici story and focus on the dramatic moments, the conspiracy of the Pazzi, the rise of Lorenzo, the grandeur of the popes, the political storms, the secret alliances, the wars and the peace treaties. But the deeper truth of their legacy lies in something softer, something more enduring. They believed in the potential of human creativity. They believed in what Florence could become if people were given the freedom to learn, explore, and dream. Consider the artists who flourished under their wing. Without the Medici, Michelangelo might have remained a misunderstood sculptor in a workshop, unable to access rare marble or intellectual companionship. Botticelli may never have painted the ethereal visions that shaped Western imagination. Donatello's brilliance might have been buried beneath financial hardship. Galileo might not have had the support that allowed him to question the very heavens. The Medici did not simply commission art, they cultivated courage. They nurtured the fragile spark of genius until it became a blaze that lit the world, and their influence did not stop at Florence's borders. French cuisine, shaped by Catherine de' Medici's chefs. Rome's artistic explosion, ignited under Medici popes. European court culture, influenced by Florentine innovation. Banking systems refined by Medici calculation. Diplomatic practices shaped by their balancing of power. Scientific approaches inspired by their thirst for knowledge. These ripples continue across continents. Walk through modern Europe, and you find traces of the Medici everywhere. Walk through a museum, and you see their breath in every Renaissance piece. Walk through a university, and you feel their encouragement in every scholar who asks a question no one has answered before. Walk through Florence, and you feel them most of all in the hum of life, in the play of sunlight across old stone. In the hush of the Uffizi's corridors, where visitors stand motionless before masterpieces that once hung in Medici halls, yet beyond the beauty and achievements, there is something tender in the Medici legacy, the reminder that greatness does not always arrive as conquest. Sometimes it arrives as encouragement, as belief, as the quiet decision to lift someone up rather than push them down. The Medici changed the world not through brutality, but through trust in artists. thinkers, architects, explorers, and in Florence itself. Their patronage was not accidental. It was intentional, rooted in the conviction that human beings flourish when given space to express their gifts. This belief shaped the Renaissance, and even now, centuries later, it shapes us. When a young artist picks up a brush and dreams of touching eternity, they echo Medici-supported hands. When an architect designs a dome or a museum meant to inspire awe, they echo Brunelleschi through the Medici lens. When a scientist asks questions that others fear to explore, they echo Galileo's courage whispered under Medici protection. When a storyteller like you, Amur, brings history to life for listeners seeking comfort and meaning, you echo the spirit of Lorenzo, who loved stories, poetry, music, and the shared warmth of human imagination. The Medici live on each time someone believes in beauty as a force of change. Still, their legacy is not perfect, and acknowledging that imperfection is part of understanding them fully. They made political errors. They faced scandals. They contributed to conflicts they could not resolve. They were human, brilliant, flawed, hopeful, and sometimes afraid. Their story reminds us that even the greatest dynasties are shaped by uncertainty and shaped by the fragile, unpredictable currents of human nature. But the imperfections make their achievements all the more remarkable. For despite every challenge, every exile, every misstep, they returned again and again to the pursuit of beauty and knowledge. They believed that Florence could be more. And because they believed it, it became so today. As travelers wander the streets of Florence, they walk inside the living memory of the Medici. The Bargello's courtyard still echoes with traces of voices discussing sculpture. The gardens of Boboli still carry the scent of ancient cypress trees planted under Medici rule. The Medici chapels hold the remains of those whose dreams shaped the world. And the Ponte Vecchio, glowing golden at sunset, still holds the whisper of Medici footsteps passing overhead on the Vasari corridor long ago. In these places, one feels not the end of a dynasty, but its transformation. Their mortal story concluded, but their cultural story continues. Each generation that gazes upon their treasures adds a layer to the Legosia legacy, that grows not through bloodlines, but through wonder. Perhaps that is the truest form of immortality, not being remembered for power, but being remembered for what one inspired. As night settles over Florence, the city glows softly, as if illuminated not only by lamps, but by memory itself. The Arno reflects the lights of bridges. The cathedral bells breathe their slow, ancient rhythm. Somewhere, a violinist plays under an archway, echoing the music of centuries long past. And if the wind is gentle enough, one might imagine that it carries the faintest whisper from the Medician invitation to dream, to create, to learn, to believe in the extraordinary potential hidden inside. Every human soul, their dynasty ended, but their story did not. It lives in the colors of paintings, the curves of marble, the symmetry of gardens, the architecture of museums, the structure of banks, the curiosity of scholars, the imagination of artists, and the quiet hearts of those who find beauty even when the world feels heavy. The Medici taught the world that beauty is not a luxury, it is a necessity, a light in the darkness, a gentle flame that guides us toward who we might become. And as you rest now, drifting deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, know that the Medici legacy moves with you, reminding you that history is not distant or cold, but alive, warm, human, and forever whispering stories that help us understand ourselves. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits.